Hello, and thank you so much for logging in. I wanted to start this Artscapes Home series with one of my favourite paintings in the National Gallery in London. It's Hogarth's Simply Gorgeous, The Shrimp Girl. It's not got any particular relevance to this crisis at the moment, but I've chosen it just because it makes me so joyful, and I hope that you find it uplifting as well. So here she is, Hogarth's wonderful Shrimp Girl, painted in the early 1740s. Now, we don't know who she is. We don't know whether Hogarth knew who she was, but I'm pretty certain, due to the spontaneity of the work, that Hogarth would have sketched her from life. She was probably working in Billingsgate Fish Market, which still stands today, by the way. There's a wicker platter of shrimps on her head. Maybe there are cockles in there, mussels in there as well, and there's the half-pint measure that you can see. And she would walk through the streets of London, calling out the costs of her wares and attracting buyers. She's moving diagonally towards us, and perhaps we're going to be her next target. And I must admit, I would certainly buy some shrimps off her. She's so attractive. She's just radiant with life, and yet it's strange because when you go to the National Gallery, this painting is pretty easy to miss. And it's entirely because she sits next to a very famous series of paintings, also by Hogarth. These are much more famous. They're called the Mariage à la Mode series, 6 paintings that were made to become engravings. And they're all about the follies of arranged marriages. It was pretty typical in the 18th century for wealth and titles to be combined in these arranged marriages, and more often than not, they ended very unhappily, or even started unhappily. And these works are typical Hogarth satirical paintings. They're bitingly satirical, full of wit, full of detail, and I just want to show you the first painting so that you can get a bit of an idea of why the Shrimp Girl is very different to what we're used to. So here we have the marriage settlement, the beginning of this doomed affair, and it is jam-packed full of details. You can spend hours enjoying these works, and I know these paintings extremely well, and even when I go back to the National Gallery and look at them, I see new things time and again. Now you have to read these paintings almost like you would read a book, as they were made specifically to become engravings. You need to read the paintings in a slightly different way to the engravings. So the engravings you read literally like a book from left to right, whereas the paintings we would read from right to left. And this is because when you transfer a painting to an engraving, they're printed on the reverse. So here with the paintings, let's start on the right-hand side, and we have the brilliantly named Earl Squanderfield. We know what his name is because when Hogarth would release the engravings, he would talk about who was who. And he's pretentiously pointing to his family tree that leads all the way back to William the Conqueror. And you can see his gouty foot, he's been eating and drinking too much, is resting on a footstool that has a coronet on it. And in the background, you can see the Palladian house, at the height of fashion, this kind of architectural style in the middle of the 18th century, is struggling a little bit. The scaffolding is still up, the stonemasons are still working away outside, and it seems as though he is running out of cash. So how does he fix this? He marries off his son to a merchant's daughter, and here we've got the merchant in his red coat inspecting the marriage settlement, and you can see a large dowry of cash has been pushed towards Squanderfield, so aptly named now that we know what's going on. Now, if you look onto the left-hand side of the painting, you can see Squanderfield's son in the blue coat. And there he is, taking snuff, lovingly looking at himself in the mirror. He looks pretty dreadful, doesn't he? And you can see that he's got this big patch on his neck. That indicates to us that he's more than likely to have syphilis. and the patch is covering up a syphilitic sore. So what his wife-to-be is in for is, well, goodness knows, she will no doubt contract the disease herself. She's looking pretty miserable. They're back to back. They're not engaging at all with each other. And you can see that she's listlessly twirling her wedding ring on her handkerchief, which in the 18th century, by the way, people would have said that she was betraying her class because she's showing her emotion in that kind of way. And there's this rather creepy man leering over her that we know is called Silvertongue, and he is the lawyer. And, pun definitely intended, he is sharpening his quill here as he looks down at her. At their feet, you can see these two dogs. Hogarth used dogs a lot in his satirical works. They're chained together. They're reflecting the man and woman above them. And I quite like this detail of the young man's shoes. You can see he's got red heels. This was a fashion that came from France, that came from Louis XIV, in fact. And the King of France wanted to wear red heels like this, partly because he was a bit short and he wanted a little bit of extra height, but the red was to indicate the fact that he would never walk around the streets with the common people. He would be carried by sedan chairs or in carriages, and they're pristine and clean, no dirt on them, and you can see that better with the red heel than with a black heel. And this tradition was carried into the English aristocracy as well, and I'm kind of presuming this is where Christian Louboutin got his red-heeled idea from. So in works like this, it's all about the minutiae, it's all about the detail, and you can just pore over these paintings for hours. We have a completely different setup here. Gone is the detail. I mean, yes, it's a sketch, but it's really all about the paint, this work. Hogarth kept this work in his studio for 20 years, never changing it. He didn't need to finish it because it's something very different. It's about celebrating paint, and it's so nice to see because people don't often think of Hogarth as a sensationally good painter. They think of him as a satirical artist. This is one of the reasons why I want to bring this work to your attention, because you see him here as an incredible painter. Now, look at this basket on her head. You can see the cross-hatching work of the paint. It's painted just so fast, and you can imagine Hogarth's brush moving energetically across the canvas, trying to capture the energy which fills this amazing woman. She's glancing sideways. Is she laughing at a joke? Is she smiling at someone? Her cheeks are reddening, or perhaps they're flushed from the fresh air. And if you look closely, I'm aware that this is a little bit of a rough slide, but you can actually see some of the ground of the canvas. He's barely using any paint around her eyes. Yet this very economic sweep of his brush manages to convey such expression. If you move down to her chest area, you can see these gorgeous pinks and reds and oranges, great, bold, rich brushstrokes animating the surface and looking utterly modern. And it seems that the act of painting is the picture, with the brushstrokes entirely visible, yet it's somehow extraordinarily realistic. And there's this rather fascinating line in Hogarth's notebooks where he writes, "When a subject is trifling or dull, the execution must be excellent, or the picture is nothing." Now, she's not remotely a dull subject, but Hogarth's point is interesting. So, you animate the surface with paint, and it is the paint that becomes the subject. This is not to say that they're not incredible passages of paint in his satirical paintings. If we go back to Marriage à la Mode, I just want to point something out to you because it's just such a juicy detail. And if you were to go to the fourth painting in the series, which is called The Toilet, look at the woman in white in the middle. She's the sort of ultimate gossip, I think, who's sitting next to the Countess in yellow. And the woman in white has these beautiful, soft, flowing lines that Hogarth would have painted with a small brush to evoke the soft muslin of her dress. And this sits so beautifully against the stiffer, harder texture of the more roughly, more liberally painted yellow of the Countess's dress next door, which, as you can see, is full of these really rich, deep blue-grey shadows. Now, Marriage a la Mode is not so much about the paint, despite there being these wonderful details like this. It's about the story, it's about the subject and reading the story, finding out about it through all the little details. But The Shrimp Girl is an essay in paint. Now, let's just think about it as a portrait. I would certainly call it a portrait because I think Hogarth painted it from life, but in the 18th century, it definitely would not have been termed as one. Aside from the fact that this is a sketch, the people of the 18th century are used to a totally different type of portrait. The grand tour portrait of the great and good, the young aristocrats largely, who would travel to the continent, and in order to memorialise their journey, they would have portraits painted of themselves. Here's a group of them now, standing in front of the Colosseum, the Arch of Constantine. It's quite weird looking at this picture today because, of course, groups of people are not going to be able to stand together in front of these sites, and I imagine this part of Rome is pretty deserted. So strange to think of it. Men like this would go off to Italy, they would explore the antique world, they would look at the old masters, and they would learn. They would have portraits painted of themselves looking frightfully clever, well-travelled, rich. Here they are with their antique sculpture, leaning on plinths, holding scrolls, out with their hunting dogs, often looking loftily off into the distance, maybe with an atlas, maybe with a globe. They're great portraits, but they're a little bit pretentious. It's the same with the women as well. This is a gorgeous, gorgeous Joshua Reynolds of Jane, the Countess of Harrington. She's standing again in front of classical sculpture. You can see the urn behind her, and this is to signify cultivation, sophistication. And there's this pastoral landscape in the background, which, as you can see from the quote, implies a virtuous character of unpretentious sincerity, undefiled by the possession of great wealth and estates. It's life-size, it's huge, it's full length. And she's stepping forward like the Apollo Belvedere, which is one of the most iconic pieces from antiquity in the Vatican collections in Rome. Reynolds loved this pose, he would use it time and time again, and it was to recreate a kind of modern grandeur in both women and men. We don't have any of that here, of course. Hogarth wasn't interested in that kind of portrait, despite the fact it was all the rage at the time, across Europe. He's interested in her inner light. He's interested in her smile and, as we've discussed, in the paint. And Hogarth's wife, Jane, who, by the by, was the daughter of James Thornhills, she would say, after Hogarth died, "They say he could not paint flesh." And pointing at this work, she would carry on, "There's flesh and blood for you." And I couldn't really agree more. Hogarth was pretty obsessed with capturing faces, and he did it throughout his whole life. He would observe people wherever he went. And the writer Cunningham wrote after he died in 1829 that Hogarth was once observed in Bedford Coffee House drawing a very singular face on his left thumbnail. Now, that might be apocryphal because it was written quite long after he died, but I love that idea of the thumbnail sketch. It seemed that any remarkable face that he would come across, he would endeavour to sketch as soon as possible. And there's another story that goes when his friend, Ben Reed, was fast asleep. Hogarth looked at him and exclaimed, "Heavens, what a character! Fetch me a pen and ink," and proceeded to draw the squashed up face of his friend, who I like to think was drooling a little bit into his arms as he was sleeping. Hogarth would get incredibly annoyed when people called his faces caricatures, and he did this work, Characters and Caricatures, to combat the reputation that he had for his faces being like caricatures. Now, this is done to show people the difference. This is the character. You can see pudgy noses, pudgy faces, protruding chins, precarious wigs, all these things that you actually find in real life. And if you were to go down to the caricatures at the bottom, which are actually much inspired by old master paintings by people like Raphael, Quentin Massys, Leonardo, etc., these are the caricatures in Hogarth's mind. So he loved faces, and gosh, you can see that here in The Shrimp Girl. So just to sum up, in capturing the face, I think that Hogarth, well, I think he's got it down to a T. In celebrating paint, he's got 10 out of 10. And, well, for me, and I hope for you as well, if any painting is going to put a smile on your face, it's this one. And it's the ultimate tonic, really, in these rather grim times. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that. Please watch this space for some more Artscapes Home videos. And if you want to check out our website, go to www.artscapesuk.com. Thanks so much.